Thank you for joining us again. It is Steven Ellis of dailyfaceoff.com. You had told me you were rejigging your top 10 post U18 viewing. Any changes in there? Risers, fallers, major changes? We did, thanks to you, get this list, and we'll post it for you now. Walk us through what you've got. No surprise, Celebrini at the top, but any big movement in there?
I was kind of high on the silly of, really looking at him as a potential top 3 prospect for this draft for most of this season. And talking to some scouts at the U18s, some still think he could go number 2. He could go number 3. A 6'7" defenseman that's mobile who put up one of the best productions we've ever seen from like a 17, 18-year-old in the KHL. Quite impressive, but I think that was kind of a misleading way of looking at his style of play. He put up 12, 13 points this year, but which doesn't sound like a lot, but for KHL, like a young player, you're getting some really talented players who barely get any ice time. And Demidov was playing in the MHL for the whole season. You see what he is on my list there. So it's difficult to play as much as he did. So that's impressive. But, he's not Victor Hedman, which I think a lot of people were drawing comparisons to the beginning of the year. He's not as skilled, not as well-rounded. So he's kind of been my biggest dropper, I guess. I'm a lot higher on Cole Eiserman than a lot of people. I have a number 5. I think Bob McKenzie had him like 13th. I know a lot of other people put him outside the top 10, but I think that the potential for him to be a truly elite goal scorer in the NHL is something you don't want to pass up.
Steve, you mentioned Bob McKenzie's list. One of the most interesting things I found in Bob McKenzie's article accompanying his list was the notion that after number 1, there seems to be a lot of pretty much a lack of consensus in terms of guys that could go to. I think you hit the nail on the head with your take on Eiserman, in the sense that I think there's a lot of players where a lot of these external rankings sort of have players they love and players they love less. And I think there's sort of a lot of variation, at least in my experience, between a lot of the lists out there. And I'm really curious how that could manifest itself come draft time, because there's what the old saying, there's 32 teams and 32 different lists. We could have probably like a half dozen players, maybe more than that could go in the top 3 or 4, eh?
Yeah, it was my favorite example of kind of how different every team looks at it was Toronto of Easton Cowan last year. I remember thinking, some people thought I had him high in my rankings, and I had him in the late 50s. The Leafs picked him at number 28, and looking at the scouting floor and seeing all the results or all the faces, it's like, whoa, what? Seriously? And now you look at him, and he was the best player in the OHL this year.
It made sense in hindsight. And talking to Brad Living, he had said, look, my scouts love this guy, and it was like their pick to make, and I had no hesitation doing it. Looked smart because of it. And the other pick that reminded me of that, the Russian that Columbus took, who's now with the big club 5 years later, whatever it is. Everyone was scrambling to figure out who the hell is this guy. The name's blanking. I'm blanking on, but
Chinnikov?
Yeah, Igor Chinnikov. Like, what? Who? Why? Yeah. But time usually we figure out who is right and wrong, right, Steven?
Yeah, a lot of this is you're banking on what on what you don't know about these players, what's going to make these players better down the line. And you look at Cole Eiserman, he's a perfect example of a guy that last year most would have said number 2, maybe even number 1, because the way he was shooting, and he did end up beating Cole Caulfield's U.S. National Team Development Program scoring record. And I know somebody asked me on Twitter, why is that important? You won one team record, but you look at the players that have gone through that program, and you look at Austin Matthews, and you look at Matthew Tkachuk, and you look at Jack Hughes, Cole Caulfield. To beat all those guys, you have to go beat some of the best players in the NHL. Yeah. So it's incredible to see that. But then you look at it and say, well, he's not very good defensively. I think he's better defensively than maybe some people give him credit for. And I thought at the U18s, the one thing we really saw was someone who's really figured out how to play a physical game, how to bring that energy. And again, talking to some scouts are saying, oh, well, they go into college. He's no longer going to be the guy who just all he has to do is just score in the power play, and that's good enough. USA is probably going to win. Now he's in the much more stronger NCAA, where it's not going to be easy. Whether or not he's playing off Cole or with Macklin Celebrini or not, who knows? But I think with him, it's going to be having to kind of learn how to be a more consistent defender. Some scouts are looking at this and saying, no problem. A good coach is going to figure that out. Jay Pandolfo is a great coach. He'll get that worked out. Other people are saying, is Cole Eiserman willing to put in that effort? Because there's some scouts that think that from talking to them, that maybe he doesn't understand his own flaws in his game, or if someone explains what the flaws are, he doesn't agree, and that could be a detriment to him. So we'll see how that goes out. But he, to me, is the most interesting prospect because
Mm.
no one seems to look at him the same way. You've got people who think he could still be top 3, some that are thinking top, like go falling down to 15th. That is a perfect example of a guy where it's all over the place.
Okay, well, we buried the lead. It's Calgary. The last name's Iginla. He's had a monster year. He produced very little as a 16-year-old, erupted this year, a bigger draft year than his father had, a monster performance in round 1 for Kelowna in the playoffs, and a very good under-18 tournament. Give us your Tij Iginla report card, reviews, thoughts, scouting report.
I'll start off with the disappointing. I didn't think he had that great of a U18 tournament. I think a lot of people were looking at it hoping he would go out there and dominate on a Canadian team that, in the end, it was the young guys. It was the Gavin McKenna, the Porter Martones that basically went out there and dominated. And even from this draft class, I'd say Cole Bodwin was a bit more of an interesting player, and he was a fourth line grinder guy. With Iginla, though, he still put up some points in some very key games. He was very good in that final. I think that was excellent. He just showed how relentless of a player he is. And, if you look at how he played in Seattle, where he wasn't scoring a lot, didn't have a lot of good opportunities, going and then playing in Kelowna, he was now the guy who had to go out there and deliver on a team that wasn't that great outside of what Iginla brought. You see the goals, you see the points, and you say, okay, this guy's got it. But he's got that work ethic to continuously getting better. He's so smart. He's from a very talented hockey family. You may have heard of, I don't know, his sister, pretty famous hockey player.
Yep.
And I guess his
Younger brother's on a nice trajectory too, right?
Exactly. It's a pretty talented family, but from watching Jerome play, he's a guy who was so smart. He understands the game, and it's really been something he's passed on to his kids, where they think the game at such a high level. They want to continue getting better. So with TJ was just, okay, I know how to score. Let's see what other elements of the game I could do. And he became this really difficult player to play against. And I thought he was one of the better forecheckers in the entire tournament. So that's good. And I know it's easy to pick a mock draft and say, oh, the Flames are going to pick a Iginla. Like, he's a prospect that's in the 8 to 12 range. And if the Flames pick 9th, that makes sense. The one thing I'll say is if they pick him, yeah, there will be that, nostalgia factor of having another Iginla on the team, but it's not a nepotism pick. This is a legitimate guy who could be a star in the NHL one day in his own right. Probably not to the level of his dad, but still going to be a very valuable top 6 player. Calgary would be making a good pick if they got him.
I don't know if momentum's the right word, but when there's certain players every year that it's like, okay, he's a B prospect, and then, oh shoot, he might be a first rounder. Like, geez, now I think he'd be top 15. It almost feels like if he gets out of the top 10 now, that would be a bit of a surprise in the sense, like, what do you make of those types of players? Do you feel like it speaks to his ability to improve great amounts in a small amount of time, given where he was a year ago? Is it just people warming up to the idea of his ceiling? Like, is it the type of player you want to jump on those high risers as opposed to someone falling? Or is this just, we have all instances, it's just data?
So one player that was considered safe last year was Nate Danielson, who Detroit ended up picking, a guy who I think a lot of people looked at him and said, okay, we know what his ceiling is. He's probably not far from it. He probably could play in the NHL in a couple of years. And he almost made the Red Wings out of training camp this year. But we're not talking about a guy who's going to go up there and put 50, 60 points a year. We're looking at someone who might be a 30-point guy who plays a bottom 6 role, but he's good at it. With Iginla, you're looking at him and saying, what's the upside here? And the improvement year to year was so big, but I feel like he's got enough like pro level traits there where you can pick him at 9, he could fall a couple picks, and he could still get better. One name I'll throw out as a guy that could end up shocking everybody here, and I've just been trying to find ways to figure out how to fully understand him, is Tarek Parashak, the winger out of Prince George, was playing AAA last year. He had 105 points as a rookie this year at WHL. Like, you don't get guys like that happening. Teddy Stigo is another one where he was way too small last year, dealt with injuries, was playing on the 4th line at the U.S. Then he was a big reason why James Hagens just set the scoring record at the U18s, because Stigo is doing so much of the work to make that happen. This is such an important year for the players, 17, 18 years old. They're still growing. They're still trying to develop. They're still learning the ins and outs of major junior because, young guys don't get a lot of ice time as rookies. So having to fight and get those opportunities, it's going to naturally take a while. And I think, with guys like Iginla, like Parashak, like Teddy Stiga, this is just, more development time, more opportunities to show what they're able to do to prove guys wrong. And that type of upside and how much they grew in 1 year excites me. And those are the players that I'd be willing to take a chance on because the ceiling continues to move for those guys.
Well, Ryan, do you have any sort of like final crystallizing thoughts on Tij, or at least how much things have changed since he moved from Seattle to Kelowna in the offseason?
Well, I was messaging with Steven earlier, just the idea that, I think a lot of folks, and I remember early on, folks in the scouting community talked about Tij as, based on his pedigree and what he showed in his limited minutes in Seattle, second round guy, would be real solid second rounder. And I think the big challenge, speaking, knowing a lot of the Flame scouts the way I do, I think the big challenge for a lot of scouts is, how do you really map his trajectory? Because I know, I think Parashak was one of those guys that's sort of the same boat where, if you're trying to project Iginla, his role was so different in Seattle and he was used so sparingly, especially in that second half of the year, that it's really hard to really gauge his production. But I think if you sort of look at sort of for lack of a better term, the music between the notes, sort of the non-production side of his game, how he operated day to day. And, I heard a lot of nice things about his habits and stuff in Seattle. He just wasn't an opportunity to produce.
And they were a team that was a Memorial Cup threat that went late into
you're
the
not going to be
playoffs.
putting 16, 17-year-olds high in the rotation because, heck, that's why he ended up in Kelowna, because they'd unloaded so many picks loading up that they needed to recoup. And Kelowna was the beneficiary. But I'm looking at his body of work and I'm going, man, I'm glad I'm glad I'm not the person who has to make the decision, because I don't really know what his ceiling is, because it's hard to really tell what point A is and point B is outside of point B is way up here. And I don't really know where the first point is.
Yeah. It's such a huge gap between his 16 and 17-year-old season, right?
Yeah, it's like he was playing a completely different game.
The draft class, Steven, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems to have the hallmark of a great defensive class. I believe it was Corey Pronman noting, or maybe it was Scott Wheeler, that said he believes that these 5 defensemen we could see go in the top 10, he likes more than the only 2 defensemen we saw go in the top 10 last year, which I believe is Shimashev and Reinbacher, who's had a just okay year in Europe. Your thoughts on the 5 defensemen, and maybe one at a time we can wander through them.
Yeah, I think when it comes to defensemen in the draft, it's not the sexiest position out there. People want to see the guys that are going to get 70, 80, 90 points in the NHL. So that's what made last year fun. But this year, because also you mentioned Reinbacher, I still have no idea why Montreal picked him with, like, Zach Benson was on the board. I was
right there.
If you have intel that Michkov would not play for you in the Montreal Canadiens, which would be silly. Russians seem to tend to love the Montreal Canadiens.
Yep.
That would be like, go get Zach Benson. In terms of defensemen, I'm keeping an eye on Artem Levshunov out of Michigan State, just an all-around beast of a player, so hard to contain. He's not a huge guy at 6'2", but he's so strong. He's mentally strong. A guy that has had a lot of, like, he went from Belarus to having to go and play in the middle of the pandemic and go and play in the USHL, was put up an unbelievable season there, and then he was going out and playing college as a freshman a year later. Like, this is a guy that has had to do a lot of change already in his young career, and it's not like, again, going from out west to playing in the NCAA. Like, this is a guy having to completely change everything about his life, completely different, a culture change, and I think he's done a good job there. Zeev Buium, I have him actually in my mock draft, going around like 5 or 6. University of Denver player. A lot of people talked about how good Lane Hudson was last year as a freshman. Zeev Buium was better this year, no question about it. He won the World Juniors. He put up 50 points as a freshman defenseman. You see those numbers. He won the national title. Unbelievable player. How about Zane Parekh? 33 goals in 66 games. He's a defenseman in the OHL. You see those numbers there. No OHL defenseman has basically been close to him in a very long time. Ryan Ellis was kind of the gold standard of OHL scoring defenseman, and he only had 80 points. You look at Anton Silyev, and he's the 6'7" guy I mentioned earlier. Sam Dickinson out of London. So all those guys are potential top 10 picks, and this is the year to kind of load up on that.
So if we can, Jack, let's throw up Steven's top 10 again and just see where those 5 defensemen are. How much? And I think it's sort of an obvious question. I imagine maybe this is what's the kind of question you ask when you don't really need the answer? You're just being
rhetorical.
Yeah, maybe rhetorical. But how many of these guys would be a team's number 1 defenseman just based on different lists? Like all 5 of these guys could be the top defenseman on a team's list, picking in the top 10 potentially?
I think so. 100%. I think so. And it just again really depends on kind of what you need there. Some people want the size. Some people want the offensive skills. Some people want the more well-roundedness of someone like Sam Dickinson. And I think that alone is really exciting. So it's last year, David Reinbacher was the best defenseman. Simashev went along after, but pretty much most scouts would tell you David Reinbacher was the best guy.
Mhm.
It's all over the place this year.
Yeah, and how do you? I sort of framed the prior question with this class being great. Where would you slide Reinbacher in with this group? And then I suppose Carter Yakimchuk is he necessarily the next guy, the Calgary Hitman?
He's I got him at around 13th right now.
Okay.
6'3", 30 goals, 71 points. I think, for me, I'm looking at Levshunov and Bouillon, and those are the 2 that are definitely all around better than Reinbacher. Offensively, Parekh, significantly better.
Yeah.
Sam Dickinson, I'd say he's probably going around maybe if you look at this list, maybe 8th or 9th.
Okay. Interesting. All right. I guess, Steven, we thank you for being here. We'll see you in Vegas at the Sphere, I imagine. We'll hopefully have a bunch of stuff live there from the draft floor that we'd love to get you involved in. Thanks for joining us. Any final thoughts you'd like to impart with us, or maybe show us that Lucky Rabbit's foot 4-leaf clover, anything for the Flames to move up here?
Talk to Craig Conroy said at the U18s he just wants to pick first overall to make this all easier. If you're a Flames fan, you kind of hope he's right.
Geez, that's wow. So we want to pick number 1. Okay,
shocking, right?
I'd take number 2, but sure. Okay, fine. Thanks, Steven. Appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. Be sure to check out more of our content right here on the Flames Nation YouTube page. We had a bunch of great long form interviews. You can check out some videos we've done as well outside of the studio. And of course, if you want more writing or merchandise stuff, flamesnation.ca or nationgear.ca. Appreciate you watching.